From the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis, this is Indiana Issues. Here's your host, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz.
Hello and welcome to Indiana Issues, a public affairs program. We'll go beyond the headlines and sound bites and bring you Indiana's news in its entirety. Today on Indiana Issues, COVID-19 and its impact on the budget. What does this mean for schools, Republicans and Democrats, and the Attorney General's race, and a political potpourri. Our guests today, still doing some social distancing, are Republican Pete Tew, Democrat Kip Tew, and Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. So, gentlemen, appreciate you all being with us. Well, state revenues have plummeted due to COVID-19. The state apparently has had to dip into $1 billion with a surplus and expected to lose possibly another $3 to $4 billion. So, can the state survive? Can it function with such a revenue shortage? Pete Tew, my friend, let us begin with you. How is Governor Holcomb going to deal with all this?
Well, we can start with this. Indiana is in a much better position than our neighboring states and a much better position than most states in this union because of responsible Republican leadership. We have reserves. We have balanced our budgets. And whatever pain comes as a result of this unprecedented pandemic is going to be less severe than what we're going to see in some other states. On top of that, just this week in a budget committee meeting, we had the OMB director, Chris Johnston, say that the state is holding back on some of the CARES Act funding that we received from the federal government in the hopes that the federal government will loosen up some of those purse strings and let us use those dollars to fill in some of these budgetary holes. So that is yet to be seen. But we're in a much, much better position to weather this storm than our neighbors, and we should be grateful for that.
Democrat Kip Tew, Kip, what do you think? Can the state survive? Can it make it through with this revenue shortfall?
Well, it obviously, we fortunately we had a surplus. I think, though, that we don't know whether we're going to have a wave 2. We don't know what lies in store with us for COVID, but it remains you can really say about it.
Let's go to Brad Klopfenstein. Brad, your thoughts on our state revenue shortfall? Can Indiana survive?
I think Indiana, as Pete said, is going to fare fairly well compared to our neighbors. $2 billion sounds like a lot of money until it comes time to actually spend it. So we'll see. But I mean, I think Indiana's in fairly good shape right now. The key is going to be how quickly we recover and how quickly business gets back to normal. But I think Indiana's going to do better than most states just because we did have a surplus when most don't.
Brad, I'm going to keep you on camera for just a second here because that's the big thing. Is you're the president also of the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. How is business up in Lawrence? How are those folks managing? How are they surviving?
Lawrence has actually done fairly well. We've lost a couple businesses. I think any municipality is going to have some attrition, but we're not really losing any more than we naturally would. And I've noticed that businesses are starting to get back to normal. Whatever normal is going to be, it's going to be different in the future. And I think that everybody's kind of had to reinvent themselves and adjust to, whether it be social distancing or PPE. It's all going to be different, but I think Lawrence is going to hold up fairly well. I think it's going to be your large urban cores that are probably going to suffer a little bit, and they're going to be a little slower to come back. Be it downtown Indianapolis, just because they're so reliant on convention business and visitor business, basketball games, football games. Those things aren't happening. So I think that you're going to see suburbs and rural communities fare a little bit better throughout this.
Pete, one of the things that has popped up is also the issue of taxes. Indiana is a relatively low-tax state, but I suppose the question is, can the state survive without a tax increase, at least in the short run?
Well, I think you're going to see, let's talk more specifically about local governments and municipalities. I think you're going to see them start looking at some projects that were potentially shelved over the last several years they didn't necessarily take seriously in the hopes of increasing the tax base. So just keep an eye out for that. And similarly with the state, I mean, we're lucky. We're in a position where we were adding jobs and we were growing our economy. We were investing in infrastructure and education because of our attractive economic environment and the strength of our workforce. And so hopefully we're going to be able to utilize that yet again to bring new jobs and to bring more funds and more revenue, and hopefully not have to see a tax increase like a state like Illinois, which is probably going to have to impose a massive one to fill their budget shortfalls.
Kip, let me get your thoughts on this. Are tax increases inevitable, or can the state of Indiana hold off on raising taxes?
Well, I guess it depends on what we want to spend. We can hold off for a while. Don't know how long. But at some point, you've got bills that come due that you need to pay, which are K-12 education, higher ed, roads, and infrastructure type of thing. So at some point, you're going to be squeezed. And I think we're going to find out here in the next few months how bad that squeeze might be. I will say this. I don't think the economy has, at least for the people who are did well going in, has hurt them all that much. It's the folks that are at the bottom that are paying the biggest price for COVID right now. The essential workers, if you will, the folks at Kroger, working your checkout counter, the frontline nurses, all those folks are the ones that are getting hurt the worst.
Brad, let me get your thoughts on that, because obviously, once again, you're the president of Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. How are businesses doing? Like Kip just said, those workers on the lower end of the scale.
I actually agree with Kip on this, that they're the ones that are feeling the brunt of this. The people that are going to be okay are the ones that are on salary and have been paid throughout this. But you're right; it's the service economy and the service industry, I think, is going to be slow to recover. And for the most part, I think people have enjoyed the extra $600 a week in their unemployment benefits, but that's going to run out. And so I've heard both sides of this. I know there's some employees that are reluctant to go back just because they don't want to go back to making half of what they were, just because they can only host half the customers they have. So it's going to be slow, and there's going to be an adjustment. But yeah, I think the ones at the lowest end of the economy are going to be the ones that probably will be the last to recover.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim, editor and publisher of IndiaPolitics.org. Our guests today are Republican Pete Tew, Democrat Kip Tew, and Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. Gentlemen, I want to change gears a little bit. Despite the bad budget news that we saw this past week, the schools apparently are going to avoid the budget cuts for right now. K-12 education will receive an extra $183 million in addition to $192 million they'll get in the Corona's Aid Relief and Economic Security Act. The governor said he didn't want to touch funding for schools, but he did take hold back 7% in higher ed funding. Kip, let's start with you. Your thoughts on schools and money and budgeting, and what do you think this means for teacher pay?
Well, you see, I know I sound like a broken record with respect to that. I'm sorry about that, Abdul, but I mean, we're going into a budget session here in January. So the next 6 months are going to be, critical in figuring all that out with respect to what the economy does over the next few months. We've lost millions and millions of jobs across the country, which means that, revenue is not going to keep up with it because people without jobs can't pay taxes. And so it's going to be a mystery to see. And we don't even know what school's going to look like in August or September. That's another thing that I think we need to really worry about how we're going to open them up, and we may be talking about that a little bit later. But so far, I think that it's an encouraging sign that the governor and fiscal leaders have said we don't need to cut K through 12, and hopefully they can keep that promise.
Pete Tew, let me ask you: can the governor keep his promise of not cutting K through 12 education?
Certainly hope so. And I think this most recent development is a very, very positive step. And it shows the true commitment that the governor and Republican leadership have to education funding. I mean, we've had over $1 billion in new dollars going into K through 12 education since Eric Holcomb became governor in 2017. And now we're making sure that these increases that are planned will continue. But the big question is, of course, as Kip said, the 2021 budget session. Teacher pay was going to be the dominant issue. The pandemic now came into the picture, and we're trying to figure out what school looks like, what traditional learning looks like, in-person learning, e-learning, hybrid approaches. It's anyone's guess how that's all going to shake out come the fall and the spring of next year, and whether the teachers and the education community has the political wherewithal to continue the conversation if they're distracted by just trying to stay above water as we navigate the pandemic.
Brad, let me get your thoughts on the issue of teacher pay in particular, because I know you happen to be dating a teacher right now. Do the teachers expect a salary increase, or has the pandemic basically taken that off the table right now?
Teachers are nervous, and I think it's just because they hear a lot of rumor and innuendo, and they see that there are some agencies that are having to suffer through some budget cuts. It's in the budget, so at least for this year, I think that the teachers are, there's not going to be teacher cuts just because the state's promised the funding, and the funding should be there. In the future, it probably will look different, and I think the state's going to have to figure out how are they going to handle e-learning. I know I had lunch with the superintendent of the Lawrence Township Schools earlier this week, and he and I talked, and he was saying, listen, there's never been a period in time where kids have been out of school for as long as they're going to be out of school this time around. He goes, but the fact is, education happens in person, and kids will be back in the schools this fall. And I think that that's probably going to be the standard. I think that they'll probably take some precautions, but ultimately kids will be back in school, and I don't foresee a budget cut coming on that.
Kip, what do you think this will do for colleges, universities? Because whether it's IU, Purdue, or Ivy Tech, or Indiana State University, or Purdue University at Fort Wayne, they've had to cut back about 7% of their budget. Do you think they'll be able to manage and get through?
I do, but it's gonna be tough. 7% is not an insignificant amount of money for all of these schools. Some of them have been smart and done contingency planning. So I think that, that's something that they can hang their hat on. I would hope that when we take another look at the budget, we try to do what we can to shore that 7% up, because higher education is the key to our future. And when you cut the key to your future, you're not helping your future. So it seems to me that, you need to be funding those things, those kinds of investments that lead to long-term economic development, lead to greater knowledge. So we don't have a deficit in that area as well. So they're actually the most critical after K through 12 of things that we fund in this state. And I think that that 7% cut is a big hit.
Pete, before we take a break here, I want to get your thoughts on this, particularly the local government element to all this, because local governments don't feel the pinch for a year to 18 months out of any sort of economic damage that happens at the state level. If you were advising local governments, Pete Seed, what would you be telling them to do right now?
Well, as I said earlier, start looking at things that they maybe didn't take seriously a year or two or even 5 years ago. And I'm already hearing that from local governments. They're really trying to cast a wide net and look for opportunities. Thankfully, we've got some pretty strong economic development zones, regional zones around this state that are actively competing to bring in jobs and economic development to their cities and their towns. And so you're starting to see that happen. And even though they may not feel the pinch for another 18 months, they're being very long-term and thoughtful in how they approach this, because they know that the pinch will eventually come.
Brad, real quick here before we break, Curtin Shepard, do you see that making a comeback?
Possibly. I mean, I've heard things like they want to cut recess and physical education. I just don't know how you can do that. I mean, kids need the release to burn off energy during the day. And I mean, educators know how best to educate kids, and you can have all the commissions you want to take a look at it. But ultimately, I think we need to trust those who went to school and have at least bachelor's degrees and oftentimes advanced degrees in educating children. Let them do what they were trained to do.
You're watching Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim, editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our guests today are Republican Pete Seed, Democrat Kip Tew, and Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. I'm going to take ourselves a quick break. When we come back, the race for Attorney General and some political potpourri. I'll explain to you what that means. You're watching Indiana Issues from the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. We'll be right back. And welcome back to Indiana Issues. I'm Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our panel today consists of, while doing some social distancing, by the way, Republican Pete Tew, Democrat Kip Tew, and Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. Well, gentlemen, was a busy race for Attorney General these past couple of weeks. Democrats picked Jonathan Weinzappel to be their nominee for Attorney General. He beat State Senator Karen Tallien by 51 to 49%. Meanwhile, Republicans had their race this week. Candidates where there was Attorney General Curtis Hill, Decatur County Prosecutor Nate Harder, former Secretary of State and Congressman Todd Rokita, and Indianapolis Attorney John Westerkamp all made their cases before delegates and voters. So let's start, Kip, with you. That 51-49% win for John Westerkamp, my friend, what does that mean, and what are John's chances of victory in November?
Well, Westerkamp, we want that. Freudian slipping part. Jonathan, very good race. It obviously was very close. I think there was less than 50 votes separating them. Only 80% of the people, though, returned their ballots, from what I understand, which it does make me wonder, why would you run for state delegate and then not turn your ballot in? But that did happen. Jonathan is a very, very good candidate. Obviously, he's a two-term mayor from Evansville, a former state legislator himself. He knows what it takes in politics to win. He's a very smart guy. He will be a very, very good competitive candidate for us in the fall.
Pete, your thoughts on the Jonathan Weinzappel win on the Democrat side?
Well, I think Weinzappel benefited from being the trend of Democrats with unpronounceable names doing well, and the other being Pete Buttigieg. But look, saying that he won 51-49 percentage-wise is being kind. It was a 48 vote margin of victory, extremely close. And despite Weinzappel's bank account, he has several $1,000s in his campaign war chest. It was rather miraculous that he was able to defeat Karen Tallien, a female pro-marijuana, which I'm sure you love, Abdul, liberal candidate in this environment. The fact that Weinzappel was able to beat her really, really, truly was miraculous. Of course, on the Republican side, we've got our own battle now, and we'll see how that shakes out.
And we'll get to that battle in just a second. Brad Klopfenstein, your thoughts on Jonathan Weinzappel win this week?
I was a little surprised by that. And some of it, the Libertarians actually chose not to put a candidate into that race. And it kind of lined up and said that they would support Karen Tallien. So I'm not sure what's going to happen now that Tallien's not the nominee. I just kind of presumed that she was going to be the nominee, and I knew that she was going to have Libertarian support behind her. Now that kind of changes that race a little bit.
Let's switch gears. Let's change over to the Republican side of things. We had, like I said, Curtis Hill, Nate Harder, Todd Rokita, and John Westerkamp all make their cases this week in front of delegates on the state virtual convention. Pete, let me start with you. Does Curtis Hill have a chance at winning, or is it going to be Todd Rokita, or what are the other two?
Well, I think this race remains very competitive. It, of course, has had a lot of twists and turns dating back to July 2018 when the allegations against Curtis Hill and what happened that night at the Sine Die party first became public. Then you had John Westerkamp get in, Adam Krupp get in, Adam Krupp get out, Nate Harder get in, finally Todd Rokita get in. I think most people would say at this point it is between Curtis Hill and Todd Rokita. However, I think what's most important is if Curtis Hill is unable to get 50% plus one on the first ballot, I think it is very unlikely that he is ultimately the nominee. I find it hard to believe that people voting for Todd, John, or Nate, and whomever drops off on that first and second ballot, that they're going to choose Curtis Hill as their second choice. Ultimately, if you're voting for one of the other three, you're actively voting for an anti-Curtis Hill candidate.
Kip, let me get your thoughts on that, because you've been state party chair. You've seen conventions before. Does Curtis Hill have to win on the first ballot, or is it basically over for him?
I think Pete's probably right, but you just don't know. I mean, the Rokita voter and the Curtis Hill voter, I think, are pretty similar. Probably have a pretty similar outlook on life. Rokita has gone all in on Trump, and Hill has gone all in on Trump, and so you got two Trumpers running, and but I think what's going to happen is the second ballot will be Hill versus Rokita, and so Rokita may get those votes instead of Hill. Who knows? But Pete's probably right about that. If I'm Jonathan Weisapple, I want to run against either Curtis Hill or Todd Rokita, so either one of them is going to be the candidate I would want.
Brad, let me get your thoughts on this before we go to our next topic. Does Curtis Hill have to win on the first ballot?
I think Curtis Hill does have to win on the first ballot. I agree with Pete on this, that, yeah, it's either a referendum on you're pro Curtis Hill or against Curtis Hill, but I don't think that those cross over very much. I think Curtis Hill probably survives and becomes the nominee, but I can see that getting very contentious. And I think the general election, this might be an opportunity for the Democrats to take one.
You're watching Indiana Issues, weekly public affairs program. I'm your host, Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Our guests today are Republican Pete Tew, Democrat Kip Tew, and Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. Well, gentlemen, the political potpourri moment, I want to share some primary results with you. We noticed something interesting with about 98% of the votes in. I want to show you this chart. Donald Trump, basically 496,000 votes, 43,000 voted for Bill Weld. Eric Holcomb, actually the top vote getter in the primary with about 515,000 votes. Joe Biden, 366,000 with 110,000 voting for Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and other candidates. And Dr. Woody Myers, 391,000. Pete, let me start with you. Looking at these election results, what does this tell you about the Indiana electorate, or does it tell us much of anything?
I don't think it tells us a whole lot of anything. It's hard to put stock in primary numbers like this, particularly on the presidential side, when it is a foregone conclusion who the nominees will be. We knew that Donald Trump would be the Republican nominee and Joe Biden the Democrat nominee. So it's much easier for a voter to cast a protest vote in one of those primaries, much harder for that same voter to cast a protest vote when it comes to the general election and it's all on the line. I would say, having said that, it's clear that Eric Holcomb is in the driver's seat in the governor's race. I think we would probably all agree to that, maybe with the exception of Kip. But with a 72% approval rating for his job overall, and 83% approval rating for his handling of the pandemic crisis, he is clearly in the driver's seat. He's not going to be, as he would say, he's not going to be caught watching the paint dry, but I think he is on a glide path to reelection.
Kip, your thoughts on those election results, and once again, does that really tell us anything about the electorate?
Well, I agree with Pete on the first part. You can't read too much into primary results. I think that because the dynamics were different on both sides, and you had it already decided. So I would say if you're an incumbent and you have that many people voting as a protest vote, it does say something. And the question is whether Joe Biden can pick those people up. But it's still a wait and see as to whether Biden's even going to compete in Indiana. And if you're asking me today, I'd say he's probably not going to compete, so it doesn't really matter. As to the governor being in the driver's seat, I completely agree with Pete. He is in the driver's seat, but that doesn't mean he can't crash the car. And so he definitely, is the odds-on favorite to win the governor's race. But there's a lot that could happen between now and November. We've seen so many things happen already just in 3 months. We had a global pandemic. We had, the killing in Minneapolis that has set off massive protests all over the country, and Black Lives Matter protests. And so who knows what's going to happen in the next 3 months. And so, yes, the governor's in a good position, but no race has ever led pipes cinched, and this one isn't either.
Brad,
Sorry, real quickly, our candidate, Dr. Myers, is on paper in a perfect position. He's a physician. You're in a global pandemic. People may want to turn to somebody that knows something about medicine as their governor.
Brad, let me get your thoughts on, like I said, the dynamics in all this. Do these numbers really tell us anything?
I think had the number of undervotes been significant, it appeared it was about 8% for Governor Holcomb. You had, what about it? Again, 9-10% that voted for Bill Weld as opposed to Donald Trump. Had those numbers been 25-30%, I think that there would be reason to be concerned if you're Eric Holcomb or even the president here in Indiana. But I think those numbers are small enough that there was a little bit of a protest vote, but not enough that it's really going to affect things too much. I do think Donald Trump probably carries Indiana, even though I'd love to see a good result for Joe Jorgensen. And then I just don't see the Democrats throwing a lot of resources behind Woody Myers. I think Eric Holcomb's fairly popular. He hasn't really made any missteps. So I would foresee the Democrats on a statewide level putting most of their resources behind their attorney general candidate.
Kip, do you see that happening? That Democrats with limited resources they have will try to get the attorney general's race rather than the governor's race?
Well, I always find it humorous. People think that there's some, grand behind the scenes. Everybody's going to say, let's all put our money here and not put our money there. That's really not how it works at a statewide level. How it works is whoever works the hardest to convince people to give them money is the one who gets the money. And so Woody Myers has to convince people that he's a viable candidate for him to get money. I think Jonathan Weinstapel already has that in his bag. People know he's a serious candidate. He's won before. He's been a state rep. He's been a mayor. He knows what it takes, and he knows how to fundraise. Woody's going to have to get after it. But it's not a question of Democrats all get in a room together and go, okay, we're not going to give money to Woody. We're going to give to Jonathan. That's not how it works.
Pete, I'll give you the last word on that before we switch gears and close up the show.
Yeah, despite their electoral record, I think there are a lot of very smart Democrats, and they're going to see that the smart money is not with Woody Myers. It is, depending on how the Republican convention goes on the attorney general side, it's in that race, and it's in the 5th congressional district race. I mean, they're going to marshal their resources. They don't have to, get a kumbaya room together. They can just have individual people who say, hey, I want my money to be spent wisely, and they're likely going to put it in those two baskets and see if they can succeed.
All right, gentlemen, before we close up shop here, we get to our part about predictions, prognostications. So as you look into the political ether and let me know what you're paying attention to. So Brad Klopfenstein, we'll start with you. What do you keep an eye on? What should Hoosiers be watching?
I think we should probably watch closely how quickly things get back to normal, whatever normal is going to be as far as business wise. Obviously, looking to see what the state's tax collection revenues are. For the spring, they're certainly going to be below projections. Much below is going to be important. And then watch to see what the plan is district by district, I think is how it's going to go on when schools go back in the fall and what their calendars look like, how much it's going to be in person, and what in-person schooling looks like.
All right. Kip Tew, what are you looking at? What should Hoosiers be paying attention to?
I think they ought to be wearing masks. I'm in a gas station. I filled up with gas right before we started this. I walked in there. I had my mask on. Nobody else had their mask on. I'm north of Carmel by about 15 miles on US 31. Nobody's wearing a mask. I don't understand that behavior. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. The CDC, everybody says wear a mask. And if people are not going to wear a mask, then my prediction is we're going to have a second pretty bad wave in the state of Indiana. So I think people put your darn masks on. It's not that hard.
All right, Pete Seat, what's in the political ball for you?
Well, I'm looking a little outside of the political ball, and I think the Cubs will end 2020 undefeated. The St. Louis Cardinals will not win a single game, and that is to say I am very pessimistic about Major League Baseball coming back. So while it's not politics, it's political in nature because of the back and forth between the owners and the players. And as a Cubs season ticket holder, it bums me out.
Hey, I'm a White Sox fan and a Seattle Mariners fan, so I can feel your pain, my friend. All right. Our guests today have been Republican Pete C., Democrat Kip Tew, Libertarian Brad Klopfenstein. Gentlemen, thank you all very, very much for being with us today. We do appreciate it as always. And that'll do it for this edition of Indiana Issues. Special thanks to all of you. And special thanks to our friends here at the Edge Media Studios in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Abdul-Hakim, the editor and publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time, folks, on Indiana Issues.